Today, I'm going to go over setting up offsite backups, and more specifically, how an offsite NAS can be used to keep your data safe in case something happened to your on-site data. And in this video, I want to compare the different methods of offsite backups, go over some tips and tricks for setting up a NAS in an offsite location, and just go over some other general ideas and thoughts I have when setting up an offsite NAS to hopefully make your offsite NAS secure, reliable, and a good solution for your use case. I want to say a big thank you to Synology for providing me with the NAS and the drives I used for this video as part of the Cybersecurity Awareness Month in October program. I also want to say that even though I am using their NAS and interface as part of this video, a lot of the information I'm going to be giving is going to be generic to any hardware, and I'm also going to cover utilities and ways to do this sort of backup solution if you aren't using their hardware. So don't feel excluded if you're not using it, but I do have affiliate links in the description below if you want to take a look at this hardware. So let's get into just kind of my overall thoughts about backups first, and then dive into how I can specifically set up a NAS to be used off-site. The way I like to think about kind of data availability and backups is to think of like different possible events that could happen to my data, and then how I'd go and recover the data in the case. So on the most kind of small example, maybe snapshots could save my data in case I accidentally deleted or overwritten the wrong file, as it would have that previous copy. Something like RAID would help me with a hard drive failure, and something like a main on-site backup would help me if my whole hard drive was destroyed or my laptop was stolen, for example. But in all of these cases, all of the data would likely be stored in one physical location. So if something like a natural disaster were to happen, or there was theft in the building that stole most of the electronics, I wouldn't have access to the data. And while these events are generally relatively rare, they can be catastrophic, and if your data is important to you, it's likely worth the additional cost of setting up an offsite backup. And unfortunately, offsite backups do generally have a higher cost and more complexity and planning that you need to do compared to setting up an on-site backup, as you have to find another spot somewhere else that's likely to be immune from these sorts of disasters and find up some sort of way to connect the data between the on-site location and that off-site NAS box you'd be working with. And hopefully I'll give some pointers that'll help give you some ideas for setting up those off-site NAS solutions and what might work for you. One other thing I like to think about with offsite backups is, since you're relatively unlikely to need it in many circumstances, if you want to cut down on the cost of setting up those offsite backups, it might be worth thinking of what data do I really need in this rare case. Some examples I might want to think about is if you have something like a high quality and low quality copy of media, maybe only do an offsite backup of the low quality media, like only the JPEG instead of the RAW file. If you got data that's from like ripping publicly accessible media, maybe you could rebuy and rip that media if something were to happen, and only keep the certain medias that you couldn't easily rebuy. If you have something like hourly snapshots made of your server, maybe only copy it every day instead. That'll save you a little bit of data instead of doing the same hourly snapshots, and maybe you won't need every hour of data and you'll only need a daily snapshot instead. Now let's take a look at different methods of doing offsite backups and their pros and cons. The first method I want to take a look at is just using a little external hard drive like this one here and rotating it off-site and on-site every once in a while to update its data. The biggest advantage I see of this method is you don't need to find a space that has network or power to put the drive in. So something like a safe deposit box could easily work for this backup method. But the biggest disadvantage is you have to manually pick up this drive and move it to the off-site location and then move another drive back to update the data. I find this works best with often 3 drives, so you always have one in the offsite location, even when you're moving them to and from to update the data. But I've easily seen this method get forgotten about, and the offsite backup drive hasn't been updated for months, so it's not doing that much good. But it can be a great way if you have a spot to store another drive that doesn't have power, and can be pretty cheap, especially if you have extra hard drives laying around. The next offsite backup method I want to take a look at is cloud storage. Cloud storage has really caught on in the last few years and gives you a lot of different ways to store your data in someone else's server, have all the hardware fully managed for you so you don't have to think about drives or computers or other hardware that could need replacing in the future. And you have essentially as much storage as you could pay for, with the big thing being pay for. Cloud storage can quickly add up in costs, and as you store more and more data, they'll have to pay more and more to keep it there. The other big thing to think about with cloud data storage is someone else is managing your data with their rules, so make sure you're playing by their rules, or You likely could get kicked off, or they could turn off the service next week without really telling you. One last thing to think about cloud storage is with storing your data and how long that'll take. Some companies have methods where they'll ship you drives to get the data quickly, but if you're downloading data over a relatively slow connection, restoring all your backups might take quite a while to get all your data back. The last method I want to take a look at in my comparison is having a NAS that's stored in an offsite location. The main pros I see for this method is that it's an online solution, so you can have it run your backups hourly or daily or some automated method without having to touch the system at all. It also gives you much more control over the hardware, which means you get to pick how big of drives you want to put in it, when to replace the hardware down the line, how high-end of hardware you want to go with depending on your needs. So you can kind of vary the cost with what your requirements are. The big disadvantages are all the cost is upfront, so you're going to have to buy a NAS and drives to put off-site initially, but typically relatively low ongoing costs depending on how you're storing it. It also has the disadvantage of you have to manage the hardware and deal with failures and when to replace drives later on in the future, as computer hardware won't last forever. Since cost is often a major factor in offsite backups, I threw together a really quick kind of graph for different prices of these different solutions with many assumptions I'm going to put on screen right now. But generally, cloud storage is pretty linearly increasing with the amount of data you want to store, as often these cloud storage solutions charge you per terabyte per month. When it comes to doing rotated hard drives, I assumed you're using 3 drives. So that way you always have an offsite backup copy, and then kind of have an on-site copy, and then one to kind of go in the middle so there's always a safe copy off-site. The cost for these solutions goes up quite a bit with storage as bigger drives cost more. The offsite NAS solution was pretty expensive per terabyte with a small drives, but scaled down pretty well as the NAS cost could be fixed and just easily inserting much larger drives into a NAS. And I assumed a relatively low-end NAS was used because for an offsite solution, high-end hardware often isn't needed. I want to take a quick look at what I see as the biggest disadvantage of offsite NAS storage, which is finding a spot to put it. You have to find a spot to put the physical offsite NAS that has power and a network connection so you can copy your backups to it. I've often found luck in asking friends or family that has similar interests and maybe doing an exchange, or I'll store your offsite backups, you'll store my offsite NAS. Perhaps paying for their extra, unlimited data cap for their ISP might make them be willing to let you store your offsite NAS. In small businesses, I've often worked with bosses that want to store offsite backups in their home for their business, or maybe your business that you own or work with might be willing to let you store your backups in their specific location. And if none of these methods work for you, co-location is always another option, where you can effectively rent space in a data center, give them your hardware, and they'll put it there and plug it into power and network so you can store your data in that safe offsite location. Now for my offsite NAS, which I'll also be doing all of my demos on, I'm storing it in this little outdoor weather-sealed box, along with some security camera equipment I set up for someone else. They allowed it, it fits in this box. All the temperatures within this box are well within the operating range of this system, so works just fine for me in this outdoor enclosure. When it comes to hardware used for offsite storage, almost anything that can connect to the network, has a bit of additional storage, and can run a supported secure operating system is going to work just fine. But when it comes to the hardware that I typically prefer to use and think works best for these use cases, I'd look somewhere at something like the Synology DS723 Plus. A compact 2-bay NAS I think makes a lot of sense for offsite storage due to its compact form factor, low power consumption, relatively minimal output in terms of noise and heat, meaning you can tuck it away in a corner, put it in a shelf, put it in that little external box without really thinking about the environment too much, doing too much planning, or adding much other cost to the environment you're going to store the unit in. And I like how it's a pretty much plug-and-play unit for these sorts of use cases. This unit I'm looking at, the 723 Plus, doesn't have the fastest processor or the 10 gigabit expansion or the most RAM in it, but for something like an offsite storage, you probably don't need any of those features, as you're likely going to be limited by the WAN network connection anyways for all your copies, so that extra CPU and RAM speed will be effectively unused and just extra capacity that isn't needed for most use cases. The one thing I do like with the 723 Plus is it has ECC memory, meaning I know my memory is actually returning correct data, which a lot of other consumer systems don't have error correcting memory. One other thing I do want to note with offsite hardware is I'm typically a good amount more conservative when it comes to my RAID arrays and my drive picks compared to my on-site software. With an offsite system, I likely either have to work with someone specifically to get the hardware replaced, or I have to go out there and get it. So having a higher cost to replace hardware means I'm typically going to go with something like RAID 6 over RAID 5 in order to get the additional redundancy to buy me time to replace it, so the chance of an additional drive failure is also lower. I also think going to something like these Synology 12 terabyte drives, which are kind of the most certified and high quality drives for a unit like this, can make a lot of sense, as a bit lower failure rate is probably going to be good for a unit like this, where I don't want to have to go out and replace drives off-site if I don't have to. If you want to look at other hardware options, something on a more budget or compact side might be something like a Raspberry Pi or another small single board computer, maybe with an external hard drive to get some additional storage on it. Or if you want to go in the larger and more capable side, maybe get something like a larger Synology NAS or other NAS unit with 8 drives or 12 drives or more. Or maybe even move into rack units and put them in co-location if you need a lot more storage and the high-speed network connections that co-location would give you. And if you already have hardware laying around, something like an old Office desktop or low-end PC is relatively low power and might be nearly free or relatively cheap to just add a few drives to your existing hardware. Now that I've picked out a NAS to use in an offsite location and found a spot that has power and network for me to put it, now it's time to take a look at that network connection so that my NAS can run my backup jobs automatically for me. The biggest annoyance when it comes to setting up these offsite NAS jobs I've found is typically the network connection you're going to be working with is a relatively low quality one, which likely has a reasonably common amount of dropouts on a lot of these residential and small business connections, is probably behind NAT without a static IP address, and that makes a lot of things kind of annoying to work with, so you can't just set up a basic static connection that always works like that, and you have to design your protocols with you might need to reconnect automatically or deal with changing IPs and NAT being in the middle of it. So I like to think of network connections in a couple different forms. First is a management connection. I like this to be nearly as reliable as possible, so in case something happens, I can reconnect to that management connection and restart the main backup jobs or take a look at what's going on that might be causing them to fail. And I want this management connection to be super reliable and come back online whenever possible. Then I have kind of the backup connection away the backups are run, where security is a much more important thing, as I don't want anyone seeing what I am doing with my backup connection so that my data stays private. And I'm going to go over security a little bit more detail in just a few seconds after I go over some more of my data information. So starting off with the management protocol, I'm actually a huge fan of Synology and its way of handling their quick connect functionality. On these Synology units, I can essentially plug it into my main home network, configure quick connect, and then drop it into any other network, and it pretty much always works for kind of a standard home or small business configured network. You can just access it over a web browser and manage that system. And I've seen those be almost completely solid, and every once in a while, maybe every year or two, I have to tell someone to like unplug it and restart it and it comes back online. But maybe a Synology NAS isn't an option for you, or you don't want to use their quick connect service. And in that case, either port forwarding for something like a service that could be accessed over a web connection, like one of the mini web management portals, or setting up something like a reverse SSH connection, so that way the offsite system reaches onto your server, so then you have to port forward your main network and not the offsite network, can be things worth looking into, so you have a automatically reconnecting management network to manage the system over. Now that I've configured Quick Connect or some other management protocol, I want to take a look at how my backups are actually going to be copied from my on-site location to my off-site location. One thing I'd really look at in this point is how you manage your on-site backups, if you have any, and if you use any data software to do that. While you can use software like rsync to manage all the on-site backups, other programs like Borg, Veeam, and others can make it so you have a repository that's easy to manage, makes it easy to delete specific backups you want later on, and provides kind of a nice single program solution for managing backups. And many of these programs like Borg, PBS, Veeam, and others support easy cloning to offsite locations, and they can often be optimized for relatively slow offsite connections, being able to run like offsite backups less frequently than onsite backups, for example, and sometimes enabling extra compression to get the most out of your slow network link. But if you don't have one of these programs in place currently, setting up something like rsync to sync a local data copy to an offsite data copy might be something worth looking into. I found rsync to be pretty painless and relatively easy to set up for these sorts of circumstances, and is pretty good at looking at all your data and only copying data that's changed, so that way you can minimize the amount of data copied over the network. If you're using Windows or Windows-based OSs, robocopy is a nice alternative to run in this use case as well. And compared to something like using just a simple CP command, rsync often gives you a lot more control and options when it comes to copying those files over the network. A few suggestions I have when running a job like this is to first of all try to run an initial sync with your offsite backup server on site when you're doing the initial setup, if possible, as that'll just cut down the amount of time of doing the initial sync and just use a lot less data over the network. Compression seems like a great way to save a little bit of bandwidth, and with the little CPU it likely uses, you might as well turn it on, but don't expect a big improvement with a lot of common media types like video and photo files, document files like PDFs and docx files, as those are likely going to be pre-compressed already and not able to be compressed again, so you can't expect much savings there. One other thing I'd consider doing with your offsite server is enabling snapshots if you can. That way, with automatic snapshots, you can keep previous versions of your offsite backup. So in case something like ransomware happened on your on-site location and it started to back up bad data, you'd be able to roll back to previously good offsite backups. And it typically takes relatively minimal amounts of space on the offsite backup server, depending on how frequently you're making changes. Now let's take a look at security and making sure that your data and offsite server stays accessible to only you. So the first thing I'd highly recommend is for every service possible, set up 2FA. Use something like these little 6-digit one-time passcodes on your phone or some other 2FA method, so that way you can't just log in with only a password, meaning so if someone did steal your password from some location, they can't just log in using it. The next thing is your password. You probably should make it unique, so that way if someone did happen to get a database dump from some other website, they can't just yank your password and drop it into your offsite server and log in. If you're using services like SSH that allow keys, I highly suggest using keys instead of passwords, or keys and passwords instead of just passwords. Keys are much harder to brute force, essentially impossible, and also mean that people trying using just passwords on the internet won't be able to log in. If you have a system that has SSH enabled plugged into the public internet, they're going to just try different passwords all the time, and you just want to make sure that random logins aren't able to get into your system. And since people are going to try logging into any service you have publicly accessible, turn off any services that you don't need. It's just an extra attack vector that isn't useful for your use case. The other thing I'd highly suggest you doing is setting up a VPN to put all the data over and whatever traffic you can. Typically, I like having management accessible outside the VPN, as it's kind of annoying if the VPN disconnects and I still want to be able to do management. But I'd certainly put any service that isn't that secure, like NFS or SMB, over that VPN connection, so I know it's encrypted. And in case some of those services happen to have a vulnerability, someone can't use a 0-day and get into my system that way. They'd have to get into the VPN and then get into those services. For VPNs, systems like Synology NASs and other ones have often built-in VPN servers and clients, so you can just use those. Or if your router has a server, that's another option to use. One other thing to think about setting up on your system is encryption at rest. So that way all your data sitting in the offsite NAS is encrypted and you only have the password to unlock and grab all the data off the system. This could be nice if your offsite backup system happens to get stolen or someone in an offsite location decides to look at your data, since you can't physically protect it as well. The one thing I do want to note is if you are encrypting data offsite, make sure you know how to get that password if all your on-site stuff failed, as you don't want your only access to something like a password manager to be an on-site copy of the data or encrypted in that backup. Now let's take a look at my implementation and how I decided to set up my little offsite backup demo I made for this video. So for my offsite backup demo, I have this little folder on one of my Synology NAS units, and it has a couple of my video projects that I've been working on. And I can see some of the files in here and work with it. And I've actually set up Synology to do the automatic syncs, which is rsync under the hood. And the fancy thing that I like it does is it detects that I've modified these files and automatically starts syncing them offsite. If I want to configure this sync job in the Synology system, I can go into task list and see my offsite task, which is going to that VPN IP that the system gets. So that way I know if anything gets modified, it's going to get sent to the VPN IP, which my offsite server is connected to. So that way it has a secure VPN that's running rsync over to copy all the data automatically. The one biggest annoyance I've seen with my offsite copy job is the speeds are kind of slow. I'm getting about 3 megabytes per second or about 25 megabits per second, which is pretty slow compared to I have a theoretical gig upload in this location, and that location should have about 200 megs downward. I found a lot of times if you're connecting one residential connection to a second residential connection, the speeds are pretty poor because the main internet just really isn't wired up for high-speed connections between two residential connections. It's designed for residential connections to talk to big data centers and servers. The next thing with an offsite backup is to monitor the backup to make sure nothing weird goes on and it's actually copying your data correctly. I've often seen offsite backups or any backup jobs just get forgotten about. Backups don't run for a while. You think you have backups and you actually don't. And that's one of the worst things to have happen. I'd highly suggest doing some sort of manual monitoring every once in a while. Automatic monitoring, as great as it can be, has its issues. So I'd typically look at one of these files I'm working on my offsite system and maybe just try to play it on this system just to make sure it's an actual video file. Maybe do this every month or two just to make sure that nothing weird's happening that's corrupting data and perhaps making it not in a clippable video file. This likely isn't going to play well because it's some special HEVC version from my camera, but I would try downloading one of these files and running them. The next thing that should handle most of the little issues you're having is having it so it will automatically download, automatically send alerts to your email or other alerting methods. Doing this can be a great way to keep up with what's going on your system and tell you if you have warnings like these that you're running low on space, or a drive is having issues, a sync drive has failed. It might seem like a good idea to enable every possible alert for what's going on, but with publicly accessible services like SSH in this case, you're going to get tons of alerts of everyone trying to log in, which is just kind of a given on the public internet. So don't get alert fatigue from having way too many alerts going on. Make sure you try to tune it to only see what you actually might need to know in alerts. Hopefully this was a good introduction to setting up an offsite NAS to store your backups. Let me know if there's anything I missed in this video and you want me to cover in a video later on. I also plan on covering using rotated hard drives to back up your data to an offsite location and cloud storage in the future, so let me know if you have any ideas for those videos, and thanks for watching this video.